In the winter of 1848, Mexican negotiators sat in a room in Guadalupe Hidalgo, staring at a document that would dismember their nation. The war was lost. American troops occupied Mexico City. The capital had fallen. But what was about to happen wasn't just a military defeat. It was a liquidation sale. Mexico was about to sign away half its territory. California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Colorado and Wyoming, 525,000 square miles, not because they were conquered, but because they couldn't pay their bills. The border wasn't drawn by generals. It was drawn by creditors. To understand how a nation loses half its landmass in a single afternoon, you have to go back 2 decades earlier, to the moment Mexico made a fatal mistake. The year was 1824. Mexico had just won independence from Spain after a brutal 11-year war. The Spanish Empire was gone. The new Mexican Republic was born. On paper, it looked magnificent. It stretched from Oregon to Guatemala. It controlled the richest silver mines in the world. It had ports on 2 oceans, but independence had come at a devastating cost. The treasury was empty. The mines were flooded. The economy was shattered. The new government needed money desperately, not to build schools or roads, to survive, to pay the army, to keep the bureaucracy running, to prevent collapse. So Mexico did what every bankrupt nation does. It went to the bankers. In 1824 and 1825, the Mexican government negotiated 2 massive loans from London banking houses. Barclay, Herring, Richardson and Company. Goldschmidt and Company. The loans totaled £16 million sterling. It was an astronomical sum, more than the entire annual revenue of the Mexican government. The bankers called it development finance. It was a trap dressed up as opportunity. Here's how the trap worked. Mexico borrowed £16 million, but they didn't receive £16 million. The loans were issued as bonds sold at a massive discount on the London Stock Exchange. After fees, commissions, and the discount, Mexico received only about £5.7 million in actual cash, 35% of what they borrowed. But they were obligated to repay the full £16 million plus 6% annual interest. Think about that arithmetic. Mexico received $5.7 million. They committed to repaying over £100 million over the life of the bonds. They had sold their future to pay for their present. The Mexican government promised the bondholders that repayment was guaranteed by customs revenue. Every ship that docked in Veracruz, every merchant who imported goods, their fees would go straight to London. It sounded secure. But Mexico's customs revenue was a joke. Smuggling was rampant. Corruption was universal. Regional warlords controlled the ports and kept the money for themselves. Within 3 years, by 1827, Mexico defaulted. They stopped making payments. The bonds became worthless paper. British investors lost fortunes. The London financial press howled with outrage. And in the ledgers of international finance, Mexico was marked as a deadbeat, a debtor that could not be trusted. But defaults don't make debts disappear. They accumulate. They metastasize. They become political weapons. Throughout the 1830s and 1840s, Mexico staggered from one crisis to another. Coups, counter-coups, civil wars. The country had 50 governments in 30 years. Each new regime inherited the debts of the last, and the debts kept growing, not because Mexico borrowed more, but because unpaid interest compounded. The original £16 million debt ballooned to over £40 million by the mid-1840s. Mexico owed more than twice its annual government revenue to foreign creditors. It was a nation drowning in obligations it could never meet. Then came the American problem. In 1836, Texas had declared independence from Mexico. For 9 years, it was a republic, recognized by the United States and Britain, but not by Mexico. Mexico still claimed Texas as a rebellious province. In 1845, the United States annexed Texas, made it a state. Mexico was furious. They severed diplomatic relations, threatened war, but they couldn't afford war. The treasury was bankrupt, the army was unpaid, the government was borrowing money just to pay salaries. And meanwhile, American citizens living in Mexico were filing claims, property seized, businesses destroyed, debts unpaid. The claims totaled millions of dollars. The American government took up these claims, demanded compensation, used them as leverage. Mexico couldn't pay, didn't have the money, didn't have the credit. So the debt sat there, festering, becoming a diplomatic weapon. And then in 1846, President James K. Polk sent American troops into disputed territory along the Rio Grande. Mexican forces fired on them. Polk went to Congress and declared that Mexico had invaded American soil and shed American blood. It was a lie, but it was the pretext. Congress declared war, and the American military machine rolled south, not to conquer, to foreclose. The war was a collection operation, The Mexican army fought bravely, but it was hopelessly outmatched. American forces had better guns, better training, better logistics, more money. By September 1847, General Winfield Scott's army had fought its way from Veracruz to the gates of Mexico City. The capital fell, the government fled. Mexico had lost. Militarily, there was no question, but the financial reckoning was just beginning, because the United States didn't just want victory, it wanted land. Specifically, it wanted California, the ports of San Diego and San Francisco, and it wanted a southern route for a transcontinental railroad. It wanted the future, and Mexico was going to pay for it. In January 1848, the Mexican government sent negotiators to meet with the American envoy Nicholas Trist. The Mexicans hoped for mercy. They argued that they had been invaded, that their capital was occupied, that they had no choice but to negotiate. They begged to keep as much territory as possible. Trist was not there to show mercy. He was there to execute a transaction. The United States had spent tens of millions of dollars on the war. American soldiers had died. The American public expected compensation, and compensation would be paid in land, not gold, not trade concessions, territory, permanent, irreversible. The treaty was drafted. Article 12 was the heart of it. Mexico would cede to the United States all territory north of the Rio Grande and the Gila River. This included all of California, all of Nevada, all of Utah, most of Arizona and New Mexico, parts of Colorado and Wyoming, over half of Mexico's total land area. In exchange, the United States would pay Mexico $15 million. It sounded like a purchase. The American press called it the Mexican cession, as if Mexico had generously decided to sell. But it wasn't a sale. It was a debt settlement. Mexico wasn't being paid for the land. It was being compensated for losing. And even that $15 million wasn't really for Mexico. Article 15 of the treaty stated that the United States would assume all claims that American citizens had against the Mexican government. These claims totaled $3.25 million. So out of the $15 million, $3.25 million went directly to American creditors. Mexico never saw it. The remaining $11.75 million was paid in installments over years, and much of that money went straight to European bondholders. The British creditors who held those defaulted loans from 1824, they demanded payment, and the Mexican government, desperate for any international legitimacy, used the American money to service old debts. Think about the absurdity of this arrangement. Mexico lost half its country, the most valuable half, California, where gold would be discovered 1 year later, land that would become some of the richest agricultural territory on Earth, ports that would dominate Pacific trade for a century, and in return, Mexico received a payment that mostly went to foreign creditors. The money didn't rebuild Mexican cities, it didn't compensate Mexican families who lost their homes. It went to London banks and American claimants. Mexico was dismembered to satisfy ledgers kept in foreign capitals. The border was drawn by accountants, not generals, debt collectors, not diplomats. The Mexican negotiators knew they were signing a catastrophe. They stalled, they argued, they sent the treaty back to Mexico City, hoping the government would reject it. But the government had no options. The Americans made it clear: sign the treaty or the occupation continues. Sign the treaty or we take everything. There were factions in the U.S. Congress who wanted to annex all of Mexico, turn it into American territory. The $15 million offer was the generous option. Refusal meant total absorption. The Mexican Congress debated for weeks. The vote was agonizing. But in the end, survival won. They signed. On February 2, 1848, the treaty was ratified. The immediate reaction in Mexico was grief and rage. Newspapers called it a mutilation. Intellectuals spoke of national humiliation. But there was also a grim recognition. The loss was inevitable, not because Mexico was weak militarily, though it was, but because Mexico was weak financially. The country had been leveraged beyond its capacity from the moment of independence. Those London loans in 1824, the defaults, the unpaid claims, the compounding interest. Every financial misstep for 2 decades had led to this moment. The border wasn't drawn at Chapultepec, where Mexican cadets died fighting American soldiers. It was drawn in the ledgers of British banks in 1824. And the hemorrhaging didn't stop. Just 6 years later, in 1854, the United States came back. They wanted more. A strip of land in southern Arizona and New Mexico for a railroad route, the Gadsden Purchase. Mexico was in even worse financial shape. Another default. Another civil war brewing. The government sold the land for $10 million. Again, most of it went to creditors. By 1861, Mexico's debts had become so crushing that President Benito Juarez declared a 2-year moratorium on all foreign debt payments. He said Mexico needed to breathe. The European creditors responded with an invasion. France, Britain, Spain sent warships. The British and Spanish eventually withdrew, but France stayed. Installed an emperor, Maximilian, a puppet who would guarantee debt repayment. It took 4 years of war to expel him. Maximilian was executed by firing squad in 1867. Mexico regained its sovereignty, but the debts remained. For the next 50 years, every Mexican government spent a huge portion of its budget servicing foreign debt, not building infrastructure, not educating the population, paying interest to European bondholders. The territory lost in 1848 was gone forever, but the financial chains that caused the loss remained locked around the nation's neck for generations. Debt became the permanent condition of Mexican independence. The American strategy was elegant in its brutality. They didn't need to conquer all of Mexico. They just needed to leverage its insolvency. Every loan Mexico took from European banks weakened its negotiating position. Every default made it more desperate. Every unpaid claim gave the United States moral cover for coercion. When the war came, it wasn't about territorial expansion alone. It was about collecting. The $15 million payment in the treaty was structured to look like compensation, but it was a settlement. The United States assumed Mexico's debts to American citizens. In return, it took collateral, half a country. It was foreclosure disguised as diplomacy. For the United States, the acquisition was transformative. The land gained in 1848 made America a continental power. It gave the country access to the Pacific. It provided the territory for westward expansion. The gold discovered in California in 1849 generated wealth that funded American industrialization. The ports of San Francisco and San Diego became gateways to Asian trade. The Transcontinental Railroad crossed the newly acquired territory, stitching the nation together. Within 50 years, the land taken from Mexico had become the economic engine of the American West. The return on investment was incalculable, $15 million for an empire. For Mexico, the loss was civilizational. It wasn't just territory, it was resources, it was people, it was economic potential. Hundreds of thousands of Mexican citizens found themselves on the wrong side of a new border. The treaty promised them protection, promised they could keep their land. Most were dispossessed within a generation, their property taken through legal technicalities and outright fraud. The Mexican government was too weak, too broke, too distracted by internal chaos to defend them. And the silver that had financed the Spanish Empire, the mines that had made Mexico valuable in the first place, many of the richest were in the territories that were lost. The tragedy of 1848 is that it was predictable. Every step was logical. Mexico needed money, borrowed recklessly, defaulted inevitably, became vulnerable. The United States saw an opportunity, manufactured a conflict, won easily, extracted payment in land. Each actor behaved rationally within the system. The British banks made loans that seemed profitable. The Mexican government borrowed because it had no choice. The American government seized territory because it could. No one was irrational. But the system itself was designed to transfer wealth and power from the weak to the strong. Debt was the mechanism. War was the enforcement. The treaty was the receipt. There's a term in modern finance, distressed asset acquisition. It's when a company buys another company that's bankrupt for pennies on the dollar. The buyer isn't doing charity. They're extracting value from weakness. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was a 19th century distressed asset acquisition. Mexico was the bankrupt company. The United States was the buyer. The price was $15 million. The asset was half a country. And just like in modern corporate takeovers, the proceeds of the sale didn't go to the entity being dismembered. They went to the creditors, to the people who held the debt. Mexico lost everything, and still owed money. The border that emerged from the treaty is the border that exists today. The Rio Grande, the line across the desert. It looks natural on a map, but it's a scar. It's the result of financial collapse, of unpayable debts, of leverage wielded by a stronger power. Every time there's a debate about immigration or trade or the border wall, the ghost of 1848 is present, because the people on both sides of that line share a history. They were the same nation once. They were divided not by culture or language or geography. They were divided by a debt crisis, by a treaty signed under duress. The lesson of Mexico's territorial loss is not about military weakness. It's about financial vulnerability. A nation can have resources, population, and territory, but if it's leveraged beyond its capacity, if it owes more than it can repay, it becomes a target. Debt is leverage in the most literal sense. It gives the creditor power over the debtor. And when the debtor is a nation and the creditor is another nation, that power becomes geopolitical. Mexico's mistake wasn't losing the war. Its mistake was signing those loans in 1824. The war was just the mechanism for collecting what was already owed. Today, Mexico is the 15th largest economy in the world. It has rebuilt, it has industrialized, it has integrated into the global economy. But the memory of 1848 lingers. It's taught in every Mexican school. It's a wound that never fully healed, and the economic dynamics that caused the loss haven't disappeared. Developing nations still borrow from wealthy nations, still find themselves trapped by debt they can't repay, still watch as their sovereignty is slowly eroded by conditionalities and austerity. The names have changed, the institutions have changed, but the fundamental power relationship remains the same. Debt is control, and control is territory. In December of 2006, something remarkable happened. Mexico made its final payment on debts that originated in the 19th century. Bonds issued in the 1870s and 80s to refinance those original 1824 loans. Over 180 years of interest. Generations of Mexicans had paid for the mistakes of their great-great-grandparents. The loans taken out to survive independence. The defaults that led to the loss of territory. The compounding obligations that never ended. 180 years. Britain paid off its World War II loan in 2006. Mexico paid off debts from its birth as a nation in the same year. The story of how Mexico lost half its territory is not a story of good versus evil. It's not a story of heroes and villains. It's a story of systems, of how debt creates leverage, of how leverage creates vulnerability, of how vulnerability invites exploitation. The Mexican government made bad decisions, borrowed too much, defaulted too often, but they were operating in a system designed to favor creditors over debtors, a system where wealth flows upward and power consolidates. The British banks extracted their interest, the American government extracted its territory, and Mexico was left holding the bill for a future that had been sold before it arrived. When the treaty was signed in 1848, the Mexican negotiators returned to Mexico City in disgrace. They were vilified. Some were threatened with execution for treason, but they had done what they were sent to do. They had saved what could be saved. The alternative was worse. Total annexation, complete absorption. The United States could have taken everything. The $15 million payment, pathetic as it was, gave Mexico a legal framework, a recognized border, a chance to survive as a sovereign nation. It was a devil's bargain, but it was the only bargain available. Sometimes survival is the only victory a debtor can claim. The final irony is this. The land Mexico lost became fabulously wealthy, but Mexico itself never escaped poverty. Not because Mexicans lacked ambition or talent, but because the financial structure that forced the territorial loss continued to drain resources for generations, debt service, interest payments, austerity budgets. The same dynamics that caused the catastrophe of 1848 persisted and persist today. Mexico sends remittances north, pays interest to foreign creditors, exports its labor and resources. While the land it lost in 1848 generates trillions in wealth, the border is a monument, not to military conquest, but to the mathematics of compound interest. In the cold calculus of economics, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was efficient. The United States got exactly what it wanted. Mexico avoided total destruction. The European creditors got partial repayment. Everyone acted rationally. But rational systems can produce obscene outcomes. And the outcome here was the dismemberment of a nation to satisfy the ledgers of foreign banks. The border between the United States and Mexico is not just a line on a map. It's the answer to a simple question. What happens when a nation can't pay its debts? The answer is written in the desert, in the river, in the territory that was collateral. The men who negotiated the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo are footnotes now. But the border they drew defines the lives of millions. It determines who is American and who is Mexican, who has opportunity and who must cross a line to find it. And that border exists because in 1824, a newly independent Mexico needed money and signed loans it could never repay. 24 years later, the bill came due. Not in gold, not in trade concessions, in land, in half a country. The border is the receipt, the permanent proof that in the end, creditors always collect. One way or another. The men who negotiated the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo are footnotes now. But the border they drew defines the lives of millions. It determines who is American and who is Mexican, who has opportunity and who must cross a line to find it. And that border exists because in 1824, a newly independent Mexico needed money and signed loans it could never repay. 24 years later, the bill came due. Not in gold, not in trade concessions, in land, in half a country. The border is the receipt, the permanent proof that in the end, creditors always collect. One way or another.